Dragon's Dogma is one of the games that I've been randomly thinking about throughout the years, mostly because I never finished the game. I don't remember why I stopped playing, so I'll assume that I got distracted by life or something. What I do remember is that the gameplay had a long-lasting impression on me. It's the only game I've played where I could scale mythological monsters while being supported by my pawn, a companion that not only provides support, but is constantly learning about the game's enemies, quests, and areas. They're also really, lively.
Don't let them get at the cars.
Though the biggest reason why I got into the game was because of Berserk. My obsession with the Berserk manga was at its peak when Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen arrived on Steam in 2016. The game had similar dark fantasy vibes as the series, so naturally I was drawn to it. The game also happens to take inspiration and even some direct stuff from Berserk. Like, there's literally a pre-made character in the game that looks super identical to Berserk's protagonist, Guts. And there was even an official collaboration that featured sets of armor from a few characters. Unfortunately, the collab's only available in the original console release of the game, due to licensing issues. I'd love to go into the similarities between the manga and the game, but I'd be going into spoiler territory, and this video is about Dragon's Dogma, so that's enough Berserk. Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen is a Capcom game that was released in 2013. The original game was actually released a year before that, and it was only titled Dragon's Dogma. The difference with Dark Arisen is it contains DLC content along with many new items and gameplay improvements. As for what the game's about, Dragon's Dogma tells the story of a small fishing village that gets attacked by a dragon. While everyone else panics and runs away, the protagonist picks up a sword and starts swinging at the dragon. Unsurprisingly, they fail, and the dragon ends up stabbing them and swallowing their heart. The protagonist doesn't die, but is instead marked as an Arisen, a chosen one who has to face the dragon. The Arisen also gets a pawn, a servant that looks human but has no will of their own except to obey their master. Since there's character customization, you can make your Arisen and pawn look like anything and anyone that you want. The options aren't just for physical appearances too. Your character's build affects their stats. Like, short, lightweight characters run and climb faster but consume more stamina. On the other hand, taller ones do the opposite, moving a bit slower while using less stamina. I didn't really focus on that stuff when I was creating my character, but I thought it was a basic but unique system that made combat and exploration more interesting. You can also pick your Arisen and Pawn's vocations to suit your playstyle. Fighter, Strider, and Mage are the basic classes that you start with, but you get advanced ones later on that give you access to more types of weapons and abilities. Like, you can use hybrid vocations that mix melee attacks with magic. The game even gives you lots of options for skills. Some are passive, while others give you various abilities that you can use in combat. Since combat is one of the most fun things about Dragon's Dogma, the varied vocations made the game feel fresh, and you can easily switch throughout your playthrough, so you never need to worry about being stuck in one class. What makes the vocations even better is the amount of weapons and armor that are available in the game. Like, it's crazy how almost every item has a unique model. I really like this because as much as I wanted to get the best stats, I also wanted my Arisen and Pawn to look cool. There are a lot of enemies to fight in the game, from bandits, harpies, goblins, and wolves. Lots of wolves. I really liked the combat in Dragon's Dogma because of how action-packed and fast-paced it was. Like, hitting enemies felt really good since you could feel the weight and impact from your weapon. Every action takes a little bit of stamina too, so part of the fun is trying to avoid running out of breath right in front of an enemy. Now, the special battles in Dragon's Dogma revolve around bigger enemies. These guys felt kinda like boss battles that appeared in random places. It was always thrilling to fight them because you can take them down in so many different ways. That includes climbing them. I remember comparing this mechanic to Shadow of the Colossus when I first played it, but now I think a closer comparison would be Monster Hunter. Each creature has a weak point that may be out of reach, so you can actually scale the enemy to deal more damage, and they require different approaches too, like targeting the goat head of a chimera so it can't cast magic. It was really fun forming strategies and discovering all sorts of ways to fight these monsters, from staggering them to using magic. Much of the game's combat revolves around pawns too. I thought pawns were really fascinating the moment they were introduced in the game, mostly because of how they reacted to the world around them, which I'll talk more about a little later. So your pawn levels up with you as long as they're not knocked out, and you can give them basic commands telling them to go ahead, stay close to you, or help you. Personally, my favorite thing to do was mash the help command every time I ran out of stamina. It was fun watching one or more pawns rushing to my side just to replenish it. Every pawn has a default setting, but their behavior can be modified when you sit on knowledge chairs, so you can adjust how talkative they will be or whether they'll have something like an aggressive, timid, or confident personality. Now, the most interesting thing about pawns is that they gain knowledge. They learn more about the game's world the longer you play, like they'll learn more about goblins every time you fight them, and they'll tell you about certain quests as well as information about locations in the game. This is made even better through the game's online feature, because you can hire 2 more pawns created by other people who are also playing Dragon's Dogma. Other players' pawns can be found by interacting with a rift stone, so you can filter through pawns of every vocation and level, but if the pawn's level is higher than yours, it's going to cost rift crystals, which are a type of currency used for hiring pawns, and other things that I won't get into because we're focusing on pawns. Those crystals can be found around the game, but from my experience, I got way more from having other people hire my pawn. You get rift crystals every time another player hires your main pawn, and when you sleep at an inn, your pawn's level, status, and all of that is updated in the game's server. What's more is your pawn also gains knowledge from someone else's playthrough, so if someone hires them and encounters enemies and quests that you haven't seen, your pawn will be more helpful by the time you get to those things. The same thing happens when you fight monsters and do quests that a pawn that you hired hasn't encountered yet. By the time they're dismissed, they'll remember what they learned, so they'll give hints and information to their Arisen. If you want to dismiss a hired pawn, you can give a rating and a gift that they'll bring back to their player, or you could just throw them in deep water so that they're automatically dismissed.
My consciousness fades.
Other players' pawns can also be found roaming around particular areas, so you can simply go up to one to hire them. I really liked this aspect because even though Dragon's Dogma is a single-player game, seeing those pawns made me feel like I was somehow connected to other players. That reminds me, if you're friends with someone on console or PC who's played Dragon's Dogma, then you'll be able to hire their pawns for free, regardless of how far apart your levels are. So I kind of exploited this when I just started out. I had friends who had pawns in the level 20 to 50 range, so it was a big help when I was under level 10. There is a downside to doing this. Playing with a pawn that's way higher than your current level decreases your XP gain, but still, it was a nice boost in the beginning. The map of Dragon's Dogma is filled with all kinds of enemies, dungeons, and other mysteries to discover. But before I get into the good stuff, I just wanted to talk about the environments. I think the environments in this game look kind of bland. I mean, there were places that did look pretty, but most of the time the dungeons and fields looked generic. But despite all of that, the exploration is what really hooked me into the game. The sense of adventure and freedom, along with the fun combat. I really liked exploring because I never knew if I was going to find the mini boss battle or a treasure chest. I especially love those chests because they usually contained randomly generated items, from gold to rare weapons and armor. They spawned in different locations too, so it felt like a nice little reward for taking the time to explore. A ton of items can be collected throughout the game, and they can be used for crafting or quests. Almost everything is useful in one way or another, so I ended up storing almost every item I got. That was also the reason why I think that a huge part of the gameplay is inventory management. If you carry too much, you'll start to slow down because of your Arisen's weight limit, so it's a bit of a hassle if you like hoarding stuff and grabbing almost everything around you, like I do. But just like every good RPG, you can distribute the items you've gotten to your companions, and by distribute, I mean dump everything in their inventory. So another thing that I really liked about the exploration was the game's day and night cycle. Like, it made a massive difference in the game. Nighttime was terrifying because of the darkness, and even with a lamp on, it was still hard to see where you're going. What's worse is there are stronger enemies out there, so they can catch you by surprise. But nighttime isn't the only part where the game gets difficult. There's a lot of stuff that the game doesn't explain clearly to you when you're starting out. It also doesn't help that you're given the freedom to explore the open world early on, so it's easy to get lost in the map while stumbling upon enemies that will destroy you in a few hits. At least that's what I experienced because I avoided the main quests as soon as I got the chance to venture out of the starting village. The game does have difficulty spikes depending on where you are. Like, you should never underestimate the smaller enemies because even a group of bandits can swarm and kill you. I'm pretty sure I've died way more from fighting common enemies than from bigger creatures. Most of these situations became easier when I leveled up though, but the game always made me feel like I should be cautious about every encounter. Apart from the main story, there are a lot of optional quests that you can take, which are mostly fetch quests. One of the things that you can find on the notice board is a bounty, and they speak for themselves. They require you to say, kill a certain number of rats and goblins to gain rewards. As for the escort quests, you just need to take a random person somewhere. It sounds simple, but it's really boring and tedious because of how far their destination tends to be, and the NPCs love to stand around and get hit by enemies along the way. This wouldn't be a problem if the game's fast travel system wasn't so limited. In order to teleport to a location on the map, you have to use an item called a fairy stone, but there are only a few places that you can fast travel to, at least a few permanent spots. So this is where another item called a port crystal comes in. They're basically a portable fast travel point that you can place around most areas. The port crystals are limited in the game, so it's not really a solution, but I guess it's better than nothing. This is why I got tired of exploring the map from time to time, because you had to run everywhere, and there's a lot of backtracking. I ended up buying a ton of mushrooms later in my playthrough, just so I could replenish my stamina every time my Arisen was about to be tired from sprinting. The side quests in Dragon's Dogma are a little more vague. It's really easy to miss out on them because of how they're structured. Like, a lot of them have to be completed in a specific order with the main quests, or else you'll fail them. Some side quests also branch out, so if you don't do the first one, then you're locked out from the later ones. If you do miss out on certain side quests, you can try completing them again in your next playthrough. In my first hour of the game, it bothered me when I failed 2 side quests just because I continued the main story without finding some lost book and delivering flowers to a random lady. I ended up using a side quest guide throughout my playthrough. It got a little frustrating sometimes because I had to closely monitor what part of the main story I was on and which side quests were available, so I don't know if I can recommend doing that if you're on your very first run. But it paid off for me because the main storyline was short, so it felt like the meat of the game came from the side quests. I got to learn about certain characters, and doing their quests made me understand certain aspects of the plot more. It would have been better if the characters were more fleshed out though. Some of them had interesting backgrounds, but they lacked the screen time and dialogue to really stand out. And as much as I wanted to appreciate certain characters, I ended up being way more attached to my main pawn by the end of my playthrough. I don't know if I can say the same thing about the NPCs though, because of how many, friends I made throughout the game. So the affinity system. Basically, you make NPCs like you more by talking to them often, finishing their quests, or giving gifts. That's all I have to say about that, because I think it's best experienced in your own playthrough. So for the game's plot, I think that the way Dragon's Dogma presents its story isn't something to write home about. Like, I swear, my mind was floating away in every other cutscene. The only time I got hooked in the story was at the beginning and at the last portion where the game just hits you with so much in such a short amount of time and oh my god, what is happening? But yeah, it was crazy when everything came together. The game had such intriguing concepts that would have been amazing if it was presented in a better way. Other than that, The game nails a lot of stuff, from the music, atmosphere, and most especially the gameplay. My playtime clocked at around 60 hours, though I spent a few more messing around in New Game Plus. Overall, I think the game's great and it's worth playing. It's flawed, sure, but it still sets itself apart from a lot of RPGs, even after all these years. Perhaps we'll get an even more polished experience in the next game. I've been seeing rumors about Dragon's Dogma 2, so I'm hoping it's going to come out eventually. Oh, and before I end the video, I checked out the game's DLC, Bitterblack Isle. Minor spoilers for the first 10 minutes of the DLC, I guess, so I actually forgot to check Bitterblack Isle out until I was close to finishing the game's main story. I thought that my level was already high enough at the time, so I went straight into it until I reached the first boss, and I take it all back. Let me know what you thought about the video. So I was actually planning to play through Bitterblack Isle before I made this video, but I feel like this would have been delayed even longer if I grinded for that DLC. I already have my next video planned out. I don't know if it's going to be the next one, right after this, but it's going to be about another long game. Anyway, my voice is at its limit. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.